As a small child, I once attempted to put on a concert for my stuffed animals. I sat them all in a group like an audience, and then hopped onto my couch stage and began singing like what I understood a rock star sounded like based on some random episode of 2020 and its special report on deafness from rock and roll or whatever. A moment later, my mom comes charging into the room in panic mode, not because of my jumping around on the couch, but because she truly believed the sounds that she had heard were me screaming in pain. That was all a clunky segue to get to talking about concerts. Until my senior year of high school, the only concerts I'd gone to were a Christian music festival in a field, a Christian music concert in a stadium, and a Christian music concert in a church. Throughout high school, though, I was discovering so many bands and also finally coming out of my antisocial shell. So the summer before my senior year, I finally went to my first real concert. Without my parents' permission or knowledge, I drove my friend Matthew and I down to the Polaris Amphitheater in Columbus to see Kansas open for Yes. We had an enjoyable time until Yes took the stage, and then we got bored and left 28 minutes into the first song. The next concert for us was also my first Alice Cooper show, and the first time I went out in drag in public. However, the whole point of this tangent was to get me here, to the third concert I ever saw that wasn't preceded by a religious descriptor. Up until this show, every live music experience I'd had was an assigned seating affair, except for the festival in the field. But here's the story of my first evening in a pit. Senior year of high school, October 24th of the year 2000. It was on this day that my eyes bore witness to things I'd only seen in a video, my body subjected to rigorous tortures I hadn't experienced since phys ed, and my ears bombarded by noise I had not heard since the drive to the event of which I am speaking. It was the dawn of the day of the night of the attack of the Penguins. It was the day Matthew and I went to a Gwar concert. The day started like any other, in the morning. I rose at 6 a.m., went to school, went back home after school to get the tickets I'd left there, drove back into town to pick up my concert companion Matthew, and then headed to Meijer for pre-concert snacks. Upon checking out, I realized I had forgotten my wallet at home, and this epic concert trip was off to a great start. Eventually, we arrived at the parking garage across the street from the Newport Music Hall. The concert was set to begin at 7 p.m., so we were on time. Little did we know they wouldn't open the doors until 20 after. While waiting in line, I was told by some fella in charge that I had to remove my spiked collar and bracelets. This seemed odd to me, since I understood this to be standard concert garb, or at least that's what movies had taught me. But I complied, and I put them in my pocket. Once the line got going, there was no stopping, because we were being ushered in like cattle as quickly as possible. We were finally permitted to adjust our movements individually upon exiting the hallway, and it was there that we came across the merchandise booth filled with Gwar memorabilia. This quaint little booth was run by a quaint little man whose red hair was dyed to match the 2 red crystal spikes protruding from his nose. It was from this fella that I purchased a hooded sweatshirt and a bumper sticker. Matthew bummed money from me to buy himself a bumper sticker. The hooded sweatshirt wasn't the best of purchases because I was already warm in the 2 shirts I had arrived in, but nevertheless, I put it on and got warmer. Matthew and I sort of stood around for a while, absorbing the atmosphere of the place. Behind us was the room with the booth, to either side of us were the bars of the alcoholic sort, and in front of us lay the pit. The pit was a large square area in front of the stage about 2 feet below the main floor level, and surrounded by metal guardrails. Outside of the pit were tables and benches for the barflies. As time marched on like the cold machine that it is, we too marched forth to the stairs leading down to the main floor from the bar area. It was there that we remained for a long time. At about 8 o'clock, the opening act to the opening act finally began their set. The lights had all but turned off. The audience had quieted, the music was beginning and fog was filling the stage. Fog continued to fill the stage as the band came forth, and from this ever-expanding fog, there emerged a man in red pajamas, a red hooded cloak with devil horns, and a clown nose on his face. Who was this costumed abomination? He was none other than the lead singer for Devil Cake, perhaps the worst band to ever grace a stage. I'm convinced the only reason they were up there was because they had a life debt to the owner of the Newport for defacing his property, and, as their punishment, were forced to form a band and perform in front of violent audiences. All of their songs revolved around the same concepts: fast food and Satanism. A fine example is their song entitled Chicken Nuggets of Sin. Their big gimmick, aside from the fog, was to throw donuts and marshmallows into the crowd. This must have been part of their punishment as well, because the foodstuffs provided ample ammunition for the audience members to pelt the band with. There were also the more common jeers, boos, and get the fuck off the stages. Yet, Devil Cake persisted, somehow finishing their set, and were probably beaten to death upon exiting the building. Next for our viewing pleasure was Lamb of God. The highlight of their act was not being Devil Cake. Other than that, they aren't really worth mentioning, and by the end of the second band set, we had moved into the pit and were awaiting the arrival of Gwar. And arrive they did. After a 30-minute intermission to set up the stage, the lights dimmed a third time, and the crowd in the pit charged forth to get as close as possible to the band. Matthew and I were in such a position that we were swept forward with the flow. Once all had settled and the opening scene began, I had a moment to see that Matthew and I were separated, and I was about 5 people from the stage. The opening scene was Gwar's interpretation of the recent presidential debate. On the stage there were 2 men in suits that came up to just above their heads, and upon their heads were fake heads resembling those that belonged to Al Gore and George W. Bush. They each gave a little soliloquy about how they were going to rob us of our money, and upon completion of their respective speeches, the announcer announced the arrival of a third candidate, Gwar's manager, Sleazy P. Martini. He was a tallish man with large plastic hair wearing a large rubber suit. He proceeded to give his speech, and the pit was filled with cheers. He suggested, we just vote for president right there. So we did. And of course, Sleazy won. As his first official act as unofficial president of the U.S., he lowered the gun that had been resting on his shoulder and pressed it against Al Gore's big fake head. Sleazy pulled the trigger, Al's head exploded, the blood shot forth, and so did the crowd. Our first motion was one last thrust forward towards the stage as a whole, and then chaos broke out. I wouldn't call what went on dancing. It was more like random acts of violence in the forms of hitting, slamming, jumping, bouncing, ramming, jamming, shoving, and a good old-fashioned beating. I, for one, didn't know this was coming and was literally swallowed by the mass. It took quite a bit of effort to fight my way to just behind the moshers, and I then took a moment to collect myself. That moment was brief, because when I looked up to admire the stage show, I was greeted with a blast of blood in the face. It was then that I snapped out of my stupor and leapt forward into the throng. I was bombarded on all sides by folks who knew the jig, and so I struck back. Anarchy reigned in that pit, and it was bliss. The concert was very similar to this from then on. Subtle differences included variations on which bodily fluids we were doused with, and at the end of the concert, women were brought onto the stage and fed to the giant world maggot that lived under the drum set. After effects included red, orange, and yellow hair, stained clothing, a contact buzz, and many bruises. All in all, this concert was just a concert, and yet it was an experience I have never forgotten, have enjoyed repeating many times since, and look forward to eventually doing once more.